So I would like to welcome everyone. We are having an event today on aviation, on decarbonizing aviation, and I would like to introduce the speakers. We only have an hour, so we will try to make the most of it. I am Antigone Lykotrafiti. I should mention I'm a lecturer in transport, energy and the law at the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University. And my expertise lies mainly in the area of aviation. And I would like first to introduce Wei Eng from the International Transport Forum. Wei is an economist. She is an expert in environmental economics, energy economics, environmental economics. She is leading the Transport and Climate Change Policy Dialogue Development at the International Transport Forum, which is the division of the OECD that deals with transport issues. So welcome, Wei, and thank you for accepting our invitation. With Wei, we are former colleagues. We were together at the OECD when I was there. And I would also like to welcome Steve Newberry, who is our engineer. We are discussing decarbonizing the aviation sector. So technology is a key part, plays a key role in this effort. So we have an engineer on board. Steve is the academic coordinator of Fly Zero, and he will explain us what this project is. He basically makes sure that academics who conduct research in labs, they will cross the valley of death successfully and they will commercialize their research output. So he basically brings together academia and industry. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Wei to deliver her presentation on decarbonizing aviation. So Wei, if you can share your slides.
Thank you, Antigone. And as you have mentioned, I will be going over an introduction of decarbonizing transport, and I will also share some of the trends and actions that we have developed at the International Forum at the OECD. And so we know that transport as a sector has been relatively unsustainable, and we are definitely not on track on being carbon neutral by 2050. And on a global level, transport actually contributes a quarter of global CO2 emissions. And current ambitions, as well as policy actions, are also not enough to achieve some of the climate goals that some of you may be familiar with. And in fact, only 10% of nationally determined contributions, which have been developed as part of the Paris Agreement, set a target for transport CO2 reduction. And in our projections, we've also observed that transport-related CO2 emissions will continue to grow by 2050 to over 60%. And so it's clear that we need more ambitious plans and actions that could actually reduce emissions by up to 30% in some of our, as shown in some of our policy scenarios. And one of our findings is that we do need to implement innovative disruptions that could actually include changes in technology, as well as changes in governance and policies. So in the diagram shown on this slide, we actually see the transport CO2 emissions by sector. So there are four main categories within the transport sector. So we have urban transport, urban passenger, domestic freight, and international freight. So as you can see, passenger transport still contributes the majority share of transport CO2 emissions, but that will change over time, where freight transport will actually catch up and contributes a bigger share. And so out of the existing parties, the UNFCCC parties that have submitted their NDCs, we know that only 10% provide a specific transport target, as I have previously mentioned, but 86% of them actually do have some kind of economy-wide and quantifiable CO2 reduction target. And over 80% of them also mention the transport sector, but they are very vague. And there will be an increasing need to align a lot of the NDCs that have been developed by countries and their national transport plans. And one of the actions or some of the tasks that we've been doing at the ITF is to also bring a voice from the transport sector to the UNFCCC climate change process. And I know that Antigone will share a little more insights on the Paris Agreement. But in other words, we do need greater collaboration across all sectors and to enhance cooperation within countries as well. And this is increasingly important because of the gap, the current narrowing gap between CO2 emissions from OECD and non-OECD economies. So we know that most of the CO2 emissions are still being contributed by OECD economies, but this gap will narrow over time. And so by 2050, we will see that the difference between OECD and non-OECD CO2 emissions will actually be very close. And so if we break it down into freight and passenger, we'll see that there are different insights. In terms of global freight demand, maritime shipping will remain the largest contributor to global TKM. So that's a unit that has been used to measure demand, freight demand. And in fact, ships will carry out more than 3/4 of all goods movements by 2050. So despite the pandemic, the global pandemic crisis, maritime transport has not been affected significantly. So we're seeing a decrease in maritime movement in cargo ships by about 8%. And so any changes will likely be short term. And so within the freight sector, we're still seeing a lot of growth and a lot of potential for growth. And the remaining goods will be transported by road, which is 17%, and by rail transport. And of course, the trends will be somewhat similar to 2050 as well, as we have seen in our policy scenarios. And if we translate those projections, those demand projections of CO2, we can also see a very different picture across all modes. And in our high ambition scenario, we see that freight transport CO2 emissions could actually be decreased by 45% relative to the current scenario, which assumes existing measures. But if we do implement more ambitious measures, we could actually see a reduction of up to 45%. And the majority of emissions will actually come from road and maritime freight transport. So there are a lot more potentials to actually decarbonize the road sector and as well as the maritime sector. And I know that we have two speakers who will be focusing on aviation, so I will not go into the details here, but as you can see, the changes in aviation related CO2 emissions will also continue to grow in both the current ambition and the high ambition policy scenarios. And so we know that if we break it down by region, there will also be different projections. There is a huge growth in Asia, which are the green bars, as well as in South and Central America from the baseline in 2015. And in fact, freight demand will actually grow by, will actually double in terms of emissions. And current measures are definitely not sufficient to mitigate the sector as a whole across all regions. And so we do have a few policy actions that we have modeled in our scenarios as well, and I will share some of these for road freight. And these actions could be categorized into three main types. So in terms of technology, vehicle technology, and advanced fuels, so improving the energy efficiency of the fleet. And there are also ways in which we should look at the logistics. So how can we actually design more efficient logistics and the supply chain network? And this could also include non-technological measures. So really looking at operations and asset sharing, and of course, greater collaboration across all the different stakeholders that play a critical role in logistics as a whole. And we still need a lot more research and development in terms of having carbon-free fuels and energy transition for freight. We are seeing very ambitious goals for light-duty vehicles, so for personal mobility in terms of electrification, but for trucks or heavy-duty vehicles in general, that is still not as developed. And so we still need to have a mix of policies that will need to be implemented in order to trigger any kind of transformative changes. And this will need to be a combination of policies as well as changes in technologies. And looking at passenger demand, so similar to freight demand, passenger demand will continue to increase. In fact, as you can see in the diagram, there will be, if we look at the baseline scenario, it will actually double by 2050 across all sectors for passenger kilometer. And although more ambitious policies would actually reduce emissions, or will reduce emissions by 76%, we have observed that a lot of this will actually be in urban settings, so in urban cities. Private car use will still dominate the market, but shared mobility will continue to grow. In fact, it will be the fastest growing mode, but only in urban cities for urban passenger demand. And the reason why policies, more ambitious policies, will actually reduce CO2 emissions by 76% by 2050 is because a lot of these tools are already available. So in fact, cities have been implementing the right mix of policies and measures for a while, for the past few decades. And if we continue the kind of demand management measures to regulate transport demand, such as pricing and the continuous investment in public transport and other alternatives, we will continue to see a decrease in urban passenger emissions. And at the same time, we've also seen a change in electrification. And so there have been different types of policies that have been implemented to encourage a more rapid growth in electrification, especially in cities, with infrastructure investment and so forth. And at the same time, the emerging new mobility services have also changed travel behavior, especially in urban cities. And so if this continues, then we will actually reach a more sustainable future for urban passenger transport. And there are also different types of actions that will need to be implemented in different transport subsectors. So for freight, maritime will continue to carry the majority of global freight, but we know that this is actually a very critical sector that will need to be addressed, and in fact, it's one of the three hardest to abate sectors currently in the transport sector. So the other is aviation, where we will hear more about later. And so together with road freight, maritime, and aviation, these three sectors are actually the hardest to abate sectors in the transport sector at the moment. And so some of the technology changes and measures that will have to be implemented within the maritime sector are shown here. And this, again, is a mix of changes in technologies, including vessel design and operations as well, and better fuels for maritime ships and other types of vessels. And there could also be more policies focusing on financial incentives that would actually encourage the reduction of emissions, as well as better standards, fuel economy standards or low carbon fuel standards that are currently not available and not implemented. And so if we actually focus a little more on regulating the type of fuels that could actually be used in this sector, then this will actually contribute significantly to the decarbonization of maritime. And so I will not go into the details here. As I've mentioned, we will hear more from our two other speakers on aviation. But at the ITF, we've also included aviation in our models, and so international aviation emissions will continue to grow. And even though with the pandemic causing a significant reduction in aviation demand and supply as well, we do believe that this will just be a short-term impact. And there are some other measures that could also help to encourage more sustainable aviation activities and demand. And so this will also include the changes or measures that will have to be implemented for airports as well. So incentives that could actually be provided to airports to deliver greener surface access for both travelers and workers, and how can we actually link airports to the existing transport network in cities as well. And so the changes in the aviation sector should also go beyond the design of airplanes, but also to look at the greater system as a whole and to see if there are opportunities to shift to more sustainable modes, such as rail. Shifting from air to rail could also be a measure that will encourage more sustainable development of transport in general. Okay, and as I've mentioned, so the investment in airport infrastructure would actually be critical, and of course improving the system, systematic changes in preventing airspace congestion as well, and of course the greening of aircrafts. So there are different types of policies that we have seen being implemented in different parts of the world by different airlines and by different countries. And there are, of course, also alternative fuels that could be considered. And so in other words, for both maritime and aviation, and to some extent for land transport, we do need to have a mix of policies that will be focused on the infrastructure itself, the vessels, as well as the system, and how can we actually promote a more efficient and sustainable transport system and network. And so I just want to briefly mention that at the ITF, we have developed a catalog of measures, which actually captures all the different measures that I have mentioned. And this is a tool that has been developed for policymakers to see what kind of measures will be best suited for their needs. And as we know, there is a huge gap between where we would like to be in 2050 and where we are currently heading. And so more information can be found on our website for this specific tool, where you can also see more measures, more details on the different measures relevant to passenger and freight transport. And so currently we have over 60 effective transport measures in this directory. And these measures could be categorized into 5 main policy actions. So the shift in modes, so shifting to alternative modes that are more sustainable, and also measures that are relevant to the design, operations, and efficiency of the system itself, or modes and infrastructure. And of course, low and zero emission vehicles and fuel development. The integration part of this group of policies will require multimodal transport. So how do you actually integrate different modes within the same system and make sure that there is seamless transfer across different modes? And so these are just 5 from some of the top transport actions that we have developed for policymakers, and as well as for other types of research. And so we need to make low carbon transport the default for any kind of decision making, and it shouldn't just be an afterthought. It should actually be the part of the mainstream transport planning and any kind of decision making processes. And we also need to make sure that there are actions in place that will encourage the scale up of research and production and the use of zero emission fuels. And we shouldn't just be looking at pilot projects, but also considering the challenges and some of the barriers that we need to overcome in order to scale up some of the pilot projects that we're seeing. And of course, countries will need to create the conditions that will encourage the maximum use of transport capacity. So really focusing on the efficiency and the load factor, the occupancy rate of transport. And the 4th action is to set prices in a way that would actually encourage more sustainable behavior. And lastly, to share knowledge about effective measures that will reduce transport CO2 emissions. And I also want to share some policy insights that have been developed based on some overall modeling work. We do believe that transport policies in general should also anticipate disruptions from other sectors. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example of how external disruptions could really influence the transport sector. And pandemics are actually just one type of disruption. So extreme weather conditions will be another, changes in technology as well. And of course, innovative disruptions could also help move the development of transport to a more sustainable future. And we also need better planning tools in order to improve the adaptability to uncertainty. So there are definitely a lot of uncertainties in the sector, and this will be aligned with some of the measures that will help increase the resiliency of the sectors as well. And so as countries are looking to recover from COVID-19, what should some of the measures be implemented that will not only increase the sustainability of the sector, but also the resiliency? And lastly, transport systems will benefit from policy frameworks that will encourage innovation. And so a lot of the regulations from governments are not change on a regular basis. So it takes a very long time for governments to make any kind of policy reforms or changes. And so we probably need to trigger some kind of changes that will lead to more frequent reviews and a greater collaboration with other sectors as well, including the private sector. And so with those in mind, those policy insights in mind, we're also working with a few countries and also the European Union to help develop specific national pathways to decarbonize their transport sectors. And on a global level, we're also working very closely with the UNFCCC to help bring transport to the table to international climate policy processes. And so in December last year, we've helped develop a transport pathway, which is part of the UNFCCC Climate Action Pathway framework, and we've identified 6 different impact areas. And of course, this include the improvements in land transport, shipping, and aviation, as well as avoiding, reducing travel distance and vehicle use in general, and shifting to more sustainable modes, and improving the resiliency of transport systems, infrastructure, and modes. So these are the 6 key impacts. We're currently revising this pathway to prepare for COP26 that's going to take place in Glasgow later this year. And so I've included the link to the 2020 edition, but please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to learn more about this process or how to be involved in the revision process as well. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation. I should mention that Wei is also an academic. She's an adjunct professor at Sciences Po, in fact, in Paris. And today we have students who attend the webinar from Sciences Po, so bonjour à Paris. And I will continue. Let me share my slides. Can you see the slides now? Wei, can you see the slides? Can you confirm?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, so I will just focus on the legal aspects of the topic, since I am a legal expert myself. So I'm trying to get down that thing. Give me one moment. Okay, so Christine, can I ask you? I just don't know how to remove that bar from my screen. Anyway, so can you see the slides clearly? Because in my case, Wei, can you see the slides?
Yeah, so it's not in full screen mode, but if you could just stop sharing your screen for a moment and then just click full screen and then click share screen again, that might work.
Okay. Let's try again. Oh, I have anyway, there's a bar on my slides. Anyway, let me start immediately because we don't have a lot of time. So I will cover the legal aspects of the topic. Some of you may be familiar with aviation. I believe the majority of you are not aware of aviation and the environment and the legal basis and the legal framework. So it all started with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was adopted in 1992. You know that the states there undertook commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and these commitments were predicated on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. I mention this because it is important for aviation. So at the time, back in 1992, the idea was that the developed world had created the problem of climate change. The Industrial Revolution started from the UK, for example, and the developed world therefore had to address the problem, whereas the developing world or the emerging economies, neither had they contributed to the problem, nor did they have the capabilities to invest in new technologies, in green and clean technologies, which are expensive to develop to begin with. So at the time, there was this understanding, this acknowledgement, if you like, that both the developing world and the developed world had to do something about the problem, but within these parameters. Now, in 1998, we had the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which, however, whose territorial scope, however, was limited, since it only addressed emissions produced domestically. So emissions of international civil aviation were not included, were not targeted at all. And with respect to aviation in particular, the Kyoto Protocol provided that the parties, so the parties to the protocol, shall pursue limitation or reduction of emissions from aviation by working through the International Civil Aviation Organization. So the idea was at the time that the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a United Nations body created in 1944, would coordinate efforts to internalize aviation's negative externalities. ICAO counts 193 states, so basically the mission of ICAO was to get these 193 states around the table and agree on measures, market-based measures, for example, emissions trading schemes, carbon offsetting schemes to address aviation's negative externalities. Unfortunately, ICAO didn't manage to reach consensus. I mentioned before that developing countries and the developing countries and the developed countries had a different approach, different views. And when you have 193 states, ICAO counts 193 states, it's very difficult, given the conflicts of interest, to reach consensus. So ICAO resolved at some point that its member states, that even though an emissions trading scheme for international aviation is a good idea, it is unattractive and it shouldn't be pursued further. So basically ICAO surrendered and said, well, I cannot reach consensus, sorry. And because the European Union was very uneasy at the time, and now we have reached 2004, and it communicated its ideas to include international aviation into its EU emissions trading scheme, into its regional emissions trading scheme, ICAO asked states to refrain from such kind of unilateral measures. And it basically said, well, you can apply your emissions trading scheme, you can subject foreign airlines to your emissions trading schemes, but on the basis of mutual agreement, on the basis of reciprocity. The European Union didn't pay much attention, and it adopted this directive 2008/101. And now that the bar, now I can share properly my slides, because it seems that the bar vanished. So there you are. So the European Commission adopted this directive 2008/101 at some point, including international aviation in the EU emissions trading scheme. I believe you are familiar with ATS, the emissions trading scheme. It is a cap and trade system. It's a market-based measure. So carbon is a commodity, it can be traded. And basically what the European Union did by adopting this directive, it gave extraterritorial effect to its regional law. So it acted, and I'm mentioning that since we have students from Sciences Po who will be the next generation of policymakers and political leaders. So the EU acted as a norm entrepreneur, as we would say. So basically, practically what it did, it said any airline, if it touches EU soil, so if it lands somewhere in the European Union at an EU airport, has to measure its emissions from the point it departs from its country, from its home state, all the way to Europe and back, monitor these emissions and report to the relevant authority in an EU member state and pay for these emissions, so surrender allowances. So to give you an example, American Airlines would have, from the moment of departing from an airport in the US, from Atlanta, for example, monitor their emissions all the way to, say, London Heathrow and back, and pay for the emissions when overflying the Atlantic and when overflying the United States, right? So that's the extraterritorial reach of the directive. And of course, this created a groundswell of opposition, and the directive was challenged here in the UK. So the Air Transport Association of America, which is the trade association of American Airlines, now it has been renamed Airlines for Europe, it questioned the validity of this directive. So basically, it was claimed that it violates public international law, treaty law, the Chicago Convention in particular, but also customary international law, the principle of national sovereignty, for example. And the UK court didn't know what to do, didn't know how to interpret this EU directive, didn't know how to apply it. So it stayed the proceedings at national level, and it referred a number of questions to Luxembourg, to the European Court of Justice for a preliminary ruling. And the court adopted a political judgment, which has been heavily criticized, where it basically found that the directive is valid and that it doesn't have any extraterritorial reach. Of course, there was a lot of fracas. At the moment, I remember there was the Obama administration, and a bill was passed. So American Airlines were actually prohibited from measuring their emissions, from monitoring their emissions, from reporting anything to the Europeans, from surrendering any allowances, purchasing any allowances from the market. China reacted very badly. They had placed orders for Airbus aircraft. They canceled these orders, and then they went to Boeing to purchase aircraft from Boeing. The day after, Airbus issued a press release mentioning how many thousand jobs would be lost, European jobs would be lost as a result. Russia reacted badly, India, etc., etc. So what the EU had to do was to suspend the application of this scheme, which now applies only to EU airlines. So it covers flights that take place within the jurisdiction of the European Union, intra-European flights, in other words. Despite the EU acting as a normal entrepreneur, despite the EU being very proactive, and despite the EU having been criticized heavily, I think what it achieved, and we have to give that to the European Union, is that it catalyzed action within ICAO at a moment of stagnation and defiance. ICAO had surrendered. ICAO had said, well, we cannot reach consensus, 193 member states, conflicts of interest, I cannot do anything. And it was the action of the European Union that really catalyzed action within, the initiative of the European Union that catalyzed action within ICAO, and this is how we got CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, which is a market-based measure. It is not a cap and trade system like the EU ETS. It is based on carbon offsetting. But again, there is a global scheme for aviation. Now let's come to COVID-19, and let's have a look at what is happening today. That was the history. How about now? Just before COVID, we had the European Green Deal. The Commission wants to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. So no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050. Climate neutrality, a very ambitious target. And as part of that European Green Deal, we had the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy in 2020, which has provisions on aviation and on all modes of transport. In fact, even multimodal transport, we already mentioned multimodal transport. So the idea, I have just singled out a few elements that concern aviation. The idea is that by 2030, high-speed rail traffic will double. And if you see by 2050, it will triple. So for aviation, this means that short-haul flights under 500 kilometers will have to be suspended. And instead, high-speed rail will be encouraged to provide these transportation services. Of course, this has repercussions when it comes to low-cost airlines, for example, which operate on short-haul flights. Their business model is based on point-to-point services. So I will say more about this in a while. And another target is that by 2035, there are going to be zero-emission large aircrafts, and they will be ready for the market, ready to be commercialized. I believe Steve will say more about the new technologies. I know that Airbus is developing these electric aircraft. They are working also on sustainable aviation fuels, e-fuels, synthetic fuels. They are working on fuel cells. I think that the design of the aircraft is going to change because these fuel cells take up more space than conventional kerosene, so you must find more storage. So the aerodynamic design has to change. So a lot of innovation, a lot of technological development there. Now, how about aviation? There's a basket of measures to address aviation's negative externalities, renewable fuels, a lot of investment in synthetic fuels, e-fuels, standards. Wei mentioned already standards for the design and operation of aircraft. This is something that's there for many years. The aircraft are, even today, they are plastic. They are no longer very heavy. So composite materials, carbon fiber reinforced plastic is used for the airframe. They are also electric. Everybody's working on electrifying the aircraft. I understand that this new generation of aircraft will have limited range for a number of years, and perhaps the payload will be lower than what we have today. So I believe it's hard to electrify an A380. So perhaps these green aircraft will be deployed on short-haul routes. Disruptive technology. So if you see, the European Union doesn't only account for incremental innovation, but also for disruptive innovation. And Horizon Europe is a program which is going to finance research and technological development and innovation and disruptive technologies, of course, as part of it. Air traffic management, so air navigation service providers also have to do something to tackle the problem of congestion that we have in the skies. The single European sky has been a failure so far. So the target for the objective is to ensure that the operations in the air will be streamlined in order to accommodate the growth in demand that Wei described, and in order to avoid inefficiencies, circuitous routings, and such kind of phenomena that we are experiencing today. Now, COVID-19, aviation and the environment. You remember that a few months ago, Air France got 7 billion of urgent liquidity support. So state aid was authorized by the European Commission. And at the time, there were a lot of publications in the news that Air France gave environmental commitments. And you have them on the slide. So the idea is that Air France committed to reduce domestic flights on routes of less than 2 hours and 30 minutes where a rail alternative exists, 50% reduction in the volume of CO2 emissions on flights in mainland France, 50% in CO2 emissions per passenger and per kilometer by 2030, sustainable alternative fuels, etc., etc. Well, if you read the official decision of the European Commission, which is on the website of DG Comp, it exists only in French. It hasn't been translated in English. I'm not sure whether post-Brexit the European Commission will stop translating documents in English and will keep them in their official language. The official language is French because the decision is addressed to France. So I'm not sure whether I'm saying that for the students in Sciences Po. I'm not sure whether English as a language will use its currency post-Brexit within the European Union to the benefit of the French language and the German language, perhaps. It remains to be seen. Incidentally, there are also other decisions before Brexit, which controversial decisions, which hadn't been translated in English or in other languages. Off the top of my head, I can think of the decision to subsidize Berlin-Brandenburg airport, which exists only in German on the website. So even though there was a lot of publicity on these environmental commitments, they have not been made legally binding. So if you read the decision, and I read it 2 times to make sure that I haven't missed anything, there is nothing on the environment. So I understand that the French government asked, which is granting the subordinated loan and the state and the guarantee, the loan guarantee. I understand that it is the French government that asked for these environmental commitments, something which the European Union endorsed. So there is at the bottom of the slide, there is the statement made by the European Commission officer. France has also announced plans for certain green policy choices as regards Air France. Good. States are free to design measures in line with their policy objectives and the EU rules. So basically what France did, with one stone, it hit two birds. It managed to address its environmental obligations whilst also subsidizing Air France at a moment of crisis. And the last slide, because before I hand over to Steve, on flight shaming, I want to mention that because I do not cherish at all this idea. I think it started, I don't know if it is a movement or if it is just an idea. I think it started in Sweden. I am not sure whether it is good for total welfare. So if you look at it from a producer welfare point of view, you have competition between different business models, low-cost airlines and hub and spoke airlines or network airlines. But you also have business travelers and leisure travelers. So when you define the relevant market, you have to take into account the business travelers and the leisure travelers. And if you look at what business travelers say, and there are interviews of airline CEOs all over the internet, they ask, when they are asked whether business travel will recover post-COVID, they all say yes, definitely, because when you want to cut a deal, you need to shake hands, and business is all about personal relations. So when you are flight shaming, in effect, you are not asking business travelers not to fly. You are not interfering at all with business travelers flying. You are just interfering with leisure travelers flying. And we shouldn't forget that it was the low-cost airlines that democratized the industry. Before the liberalization of the sector, air travel was a luxury product reserved for a tiny minority. After the advent of low-cost airlines, it became a commodity that everybody can enjoy. So I don't like this flight shaming idea exactly because it penalizes leisure travelers and low-cost airlines. I think we should look for positive sum outcomes. So rather than trying to combat climate change whilst curbing growth, I think we should opt for a win-win. We should combat climate change without curbing growth. And last word from me, I don't like flight shaming because flying to me is synonymous with freedom, figuratively speaking and literally speaking. And so thank you. And Steve, I will hand over to you. So I will stop sharing my slides. And I should also thank at this point Professor James Basfield from the School of Engineering, who brought me in touch with Steve. And I should also mention the Center for Urban Transport Technology at Queen Mary, which is a center of excellence. And they have been instrumental in getting Steve on the call today. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce the Fly Zero project to you all today. So my name's Steve Newbury. I am the academic coordinator for Fly Zero. So what is Fly Zero? So Fly Zero is a project that's directly funded by UK government. It's being run by the Aerospace Technology Institute, and we are it's currently a 1-year funded feasibility study to look at the technical and commercial and market sort of view of how to create zero carbon aviation going forwards. We're really taking a whole kind of holistic approach to look at the whole kind of all of the aspects to how we would go about creating zero carbon flight. And that means we built a team of about 80 people that have been seconded in from the aerospace sector as well as some other sectors to look at a whole range of different technologies and also look at it from a market and sustainability and economics and commercial perspective. So what kind of led to the need to create this project in the UK? So, you know, the UK has a very strong supply chain for aviation. You know, it employs a lot of people in highly skilled jobs in the UK, and we're keen to protect our jobs and, you know, make sure we have a supply chain which is fit for the future. But independently, the work that academia are doing and the work that industry and government are doing needs to be brought together. You know, there was no one that was looking at this whole issue as a whole holistic kind of perspective. So that's what's driven the need to create the Fly Zero team. So as I said initially, we've been given £15 million to build a team and do some work, and I'm leading the academic research programme, as well as we're working with industry, with other kind of groups in the UK who are doing work in this area. And we're by the end of the year, we're going to have some recommendations that we'll be providing into government, which will help drive policy and investment to look at, you know, how we as the UK can position ourselves in the right way going forwards. So this is our kind of roadmap. Well, a very high level look at our kind of roadmap for this year. We've got an extremely busy year with lots of things going on at the moment. We've got a big technical team doing lots of studies into different types of technical kind of options and issues, and we're working, you know, we've got conversations with many different academics going on to really build the technology bricks that will then move forwards into the next stage, which is our kind of concept trades phase. So you can imagine trying to create sustainable aviation. There's lots of interdependencies between technical inputs, but also commercial market and policy pieces. So it's a huge complex jigsaw that we're going to be kind of piecing together that will eventually go forward into our kind of recommendations. And the aim, the kind of outputs of the project will lead into sort of current thinking is 2 different sort of aircraft program concepts going forwards. That's the kind of idea of where we're heading, which will be supported by a whole number of like technology roadmaps and you know, our capability gap analysis and things like that. So we've got a real nice picture for the UK of you know, how we can be fit for the future. So in terms of where we're focusing our kind of efforts, as has been already said, so the lower kind of area where you're looking at eVTOLs, electric aircraft, you know, this area has been developed by a number of organisations that have got very good sort of private sector funding. So we're not focusing on this area. We know that the large aircraft area, this is very difficult to look at twin aisle long-range aircraft at the moment for because we're not looking at sustainable aviation fuel. We're looking at a more kind of future kind of solutions. We're trying to look beyond sustainable aviation fuel. So we're really focusing on the regional jet space, so anywhere between kind of 50 and 120 seats, up to kind of A320 level. So that's the aircraft space that we're focusing on, and this contributes about 50% of global aircraft CO2 emissions in this space. So it's a really good chunky kind of market area for us to go after. So as I said, this is a 12-month project that started at the beginning of this year. So we're really getting into the meat of it now. In terms of the outputs, so we will really be looking at developing a much deeper understanding of the robust kind of evidence that sits behind the technology, economic and industrial kind of picture, developing these roadmaps for the future, assessing different sustainability kind of scenarios, and then showing how this can be kind of developed into real kind of concepts kind of going forwards. That's the kind of plan with clear roadmaps, and really with a focus on zero carbon aviation by 2030. That's our target. It's a very ambitious target, but we feel this is kind of necessary given the scale of the challenge and the fact that the aircraft industry really needs to accelerate the work that it's doing to move us and help the whole transport industry achieve much lower emissions going forwards to meet our 2050 targets. So in terms of my personal work on this project, I'm leading the academic research program. I've got a number of relationships that have been developed with our kind of excellent UK academic network. So we're defining the project is just defining a number of research questions which are being pitched to academia, but we're also reached out to academia, and there's a lot of investment already been going into a whole manner of different technology and market and commercial kind of research areas that we're keen to kind of leverage off that research and pull that into the project. So we've set up a number of working relationships, and we've had academics come in and present their kind of research to the team. So that's all kind of very exciting for the rest of this year. And then there's specific kind of projects that we're looking to commission. I've got a nominal kind of £1 million budget that I can access to procure a number of research packages during this year, and that work is kind of ongoing at the moment. In terms of the specific research questions, this is not a definitive list, but it's a sort of first draft list that's come from our internal technical teams. So we've got, I'm not going to read through all of these, but there's a number of critical questions around material science, which has an impact especially into any new propulsion systems, because we're looking at exploring hydrogen and ammonia and other types of and looking at potentially batteries as well. So there's some underlying technologies that have an impact into these different technology areas. Also, we're looking at the sustainability of emissions and how we can kind of mitigate emissions impact on the environment, looking at noise, looking at energy storage in different fuel types, and then some other questions around more at the whole aircraft level and the sort of systems level, especially the propulsion system. We've got there's a lot of questions that we're either answering internally within our team or we'll be seeking answers from academia. So yeah, so that gives you an introduction to the Fly Zero program. So at the moment, as I say, we've got committed 12-month funding from UK government, but you know, we hope that will kind of extend forwards. We're doing some really exciting work, and look forward to sharing more with you as we make more progress during the year. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Steve. That was very interesting. I guess the most difficult part when it comes to such kind of technologies is the financing. So to convince the private sector to commit, to contribute to the development of these risky technologies. So mobilizing the private sector and what's the best economic model to do it is very, very important. So I think we have a number of questions in the chat that perhaps we can address immediately. So a question from Jose Diaz, is carbon neutrality in the aviation sector a realistic, attainable target for 2050? Steve, what do you think? Is it realistic to achieve carbon neutrality in aviation by 2050? Will we have the technologies? Will we have the fuel?
Do you want me to give a kind of initial view on that? I mean, yeah. I think it's I think it's very difficult, you know, especially for long haul flights, because of the energy, the amount of energy. Even if you move to liquid hydrogen, then you know, we need different types of aircraft and different technologies, and you know, aircraft take a long time to develop. So, and, you know, if you think now that, you know, Airbus sold 500 A320s last year and 1,000 the year before, and all of these aircraft are going to be in service for sort of 25 years. So, you know, we have a sense of kind of locked in emissions. So there's a lot to do. We also need to think carefully about the way that the hydrogen is actually produced, because even if we move to to a liquid hydrogen solution, that doesn't mean that even though we may be zero carbon within the aviation space, we need to look more widely in the value chain at what the CO2 costs are, you know, further down the sort of production cycle. So it's extremely challenging, but I think there's a real kind of focus, and we've got some very bright people that are working together to try and make some, you know, serious headway in this challenge.
That's great. That's great. Would you like to complement? Have you got an idea?
Well, so in general, I think there is a growing sense of urgency. So the commitment is there to achieve net zero emissions by 2020. But of course, we know that there will be different pathways for decarbonizing the aviation sector, and this will depend on the countries and existing infrastructure and technology for sure. But I think on a global level, we have seen enough commitment. So I think it's just really getting the measures implemented and to really ensure stakeholder engagement.
Okay, so you are more optimistic than Steve, who understands aviation as being a long cycle industry with its implications. So I suggest that we have a look at the second question. Thank you for the presentation. Are the environmental commitments undertaken by Air France as part of the COVID-19 state aid still debated at French national level, or have they been forgotten? Well, I don't know whether at French national level they have been forgotten. I don't think so, however, because I understand that the French government, in order to grant the aid, it asked Air France to address its footprint, its CO2 emissions, etc., to become greener and cleaner. So I believe it is part of the restructuring, and it is something that France will look at, not the Commission though, because they have not been made legally binding by the Commission itself. Now, Taneke is asking whether CCLS will provide the attendees with a copy of the slides. Yes, we can do that. And one more question: are manufacturing and recycling of the aircraft factored into decarbonization policies? So recycling and manufacturing. Manufacturing, I think, for sure. How about recycling of the aircraft, Steve? Do you know anything about recycling?
Yeah, well, I think the whole end-to-end life is something that we are, modelling. Certainly in the Fly Zero program, we're looking at a whole life cycle analysis of the whole. That's really, really important. So that is definitely part of the project. Well, yeah, I mean, within an aircraft, you use materials which. Typically, using carbon fiber as an example, what modern aircraft tend to use, these can be kind of recycled now into other products. So there's, how can I say, it's part of the consideration for sure. When you look at the carbon cost of the different stages of the aircraft's production, manufacture and use and end of life, then by far the majority of the carbon cost is in the use of the aircraft over its usable life. That's not to say we shouldn't think about end of life, we absolutely should, but if we're going to have, we have to focus our efforts on where we're going to make the biggest kind of contribution, and definitely, reducing the carbon output during operation is the main one.
That's right. Okay. And there is one more question that we received yesterday, and that's the last question. Yes, Wei. Yes, please.
If I may, I just want to add one more point. So that's really a good question about the recycling and manufacturing of aircraft. And this could all be under circular economy. And so there has been a greater interest in the integration of circular economy into decarbonizing transport pathways. So not just for aviation, but for the entire sector. And we are seeing that being pushed forward by the COP presidency this year. And so I think we'll be seeing a lot more dialogues on the integration of circular economy and climate change. And I think this will then trigger a lot more actions, both from the private sector and also on a national level. How do you actually integrate circular economy into decarbonizing transport measures?
Yes, and I know from my experience in aviation that passenger aircraft, towards the end of their life, when they exhaust their potential as passenger aircraft, they are converted into freighters, so they have a second opportunity and they carry cargo. So that's a form of recycling, if you like. And we received one more question yesterday from Jose again, that we are going to address, and then we can stop the recording and close the webinar. So the question is there any policy or plan which could tackle the decarbonization of air transport in islands with high economic dependence on air connections and no alternative transport means? So islands with high economic dependence on air connections and no alternative transport means, whether there are any policy, whether there is any policy or plan which could tackle the decarbonization of air transport. Wei, I know that you have worked in the area. Would you like to say something?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so in terms of small island states, we've worked with the Alliance of Small Island States, so AOSIS, on decarbonizing transport, and we know that a lot of the small developing island states' priorities or transport priorities have been very much focused on decarbonizing maritime, so global shipping emissions, as well as the electrification of their road transport. And in terms of aviation, that hasn't been a priority or something that we've been highlighted that has been highlighted as an issue for small island states, but it is definitely critical because it affects the accessibility of their transport and also their needs. But currently most of the freight transport to small island states are still carried out by maritime shipping. So I think that's why this has been one of the key priorities. So for aviation, I think, Antigone, you have some ideas for future implementation, but as of now, there hasn't been much discussion on aviation.
What I could say, looking at EU law, since I'm familiar with EU law, is that, well, you can use two mechanisms if you like to decarbonize aviation on these routes that connect the mainland of the country with islands, for example. You can use public service obligations. So in aviation, there is the high season, the low season. The high season is in the summer when there is a lot of demand, a lot of tourists. The low season is in the winter. And very often the states impose public service obligations on certain routes. And they ask airlines to operate on these routes, and they compensate them for the expenses. And nowadays, as a matter of EU law, states have to organize public tenders. So if you want to operate to discharge public service obligations, you must submit a bid and you must win the contract. So what the states can do is ask the airline, give the contracts to airlines which are greener. And we mentioned range of the aircraft and payload before. I think, Steve, that in the future, these smaller aircraft, electric aircraft that are being developed at the moment will be deployed on such kind of short haul routes, which connect, for example, islands to the mainland, rather than on long haul routes where the conventional aircraft will keep on operating, perhaps on biofuels or blend of kerosene and biofuels. So that's one mechanism that we have, public service obligations. And what are the conditions that the states impose? And this will become part of the tender, part of the conditions of the tender before giving the contracts to a provider. And the second policy mechanism that the state could resort to is public procurement, green public procurement. So you know that in Europe, as a matter of primary law, EU law, the state can participate in the economy the same way a private investor would do. So what states can do, relying on green public procurement, is just purchase such kind of aircraft from Airbus, from other manufacturers, and either operate them themselves or lease them to private operators, to airlines, which will then discharge, for example, public service obligations. So green public procurement and public service obligations are two policies that we have in EU law that could be resorted to in order to decarbonize aviation. And I think we have answered all the questions, and we have taken a quarter of an hour more than what was originally scheduled. So I would like to thank very much Steve for being with us for so long, and Wei, thank you very much. I would like to thank the students in Sciences Po, the students at Queen Mary, and all the attendees for their questions and for their patience. So until next time, take care.
Thank you very much.